following directly upon the lamentations of the fall of Babylon given by the kings and the merchants and the seafaring men of the earth, come a series of songs that celebrate her fall and the great triumph of God. And it begins with one or two gloat songs that basically mock the fact that she thought she was beyond conquest and she could never be overthrown, but now her light and her glory will never be seen again. It goes into songs of praise for God and his judgment in overthrowing the great harlot who brought such corruption to the earth and persecution to his people, and celebrates God's judgment and his triumph for his holy people. It includes a declaration of a new event, and that is the wedding feast of the Lamb. This too is to be contrasted with the whore of Babylon, and here again we see the theme of marriage as a symbol of God's relationship with his holy people, the covenant that he shares with his people, that we saw even in the Old Testament, in which marriage was seen as symbolic of God's fidelity to his people and their fidelity to him, in which adultery, promiscuity, and other forms of sexual deviance was symbolic of paganism, not considered a social sin, but rather a sin of worship, of people who sell themselves to other pagan gods and exercise infidelity to the covenant they share with his people. This is seen in a number of the prophets, but especially in the book of the prophet Hosea, whose very marriage to an unfaithful wife, Gomer, becomes his prophecy of the rather tumultuous relationship between God and his people in the Old Testament, in which they were unfaithful, and so God sells them, but then eventually buys them back, just as Hosea does with his wife. And because of his great love and fidelity, he woos them back and makes them fall in love with him again. Very dynamic imagery of marriage symbolizing the covenant between God and his holy people Israel that is now applied to the marriage between Christ and his church. In the declaration of the wedding feast of the Lamb, we hear the fourth beatitude in the book of Revelation that declares, "Blessed are those who are invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb." And who is the bride? Well, she's not described in such elaborate detail as the whore of Babylon, but she is described as being clothed in a white garment. And parenthetically, the white garment is described as symbolic of the good deeds of the saints, or the good deeds of God's holy people, or his holy ones. And here in this, just the symbolism of the white garment of the bride, we see the importance of good deeds in the life of those who follow Christ, who follow the Lamb. Coming upon the faith that we profess, the white garment symbolizes the good deeds of God's holy people, further emphasizing the necessity and importance of good deeds. We also see in the declaration of God's triumph an important word that we don't hear very often throughout the Scriptures, and that is the word Alleluia. We hear it a few times in the Old Testament in just a handful of the Psalms, but in the New Testament, this is the only passage in which we see the word Alleluia appearing, and it is uttered 4 times. First, by the assembly of heaven, who declares Alleluia, salvation, glory, and power belongs to our God. And the voices of the assembly in heaven mention that word twice. After the heavenly assembly, it states that the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures, who we have previously seen in the great vision of the heavenly throne room, these 4 living creatures and 24 elders are now declaring Alleluia in their praise of God. Finally, a great crowd that sounded like the roaring of the deep or mighty peals of thunder declare Alleluia, called forth by a voice coming from the throne. In the midst of all this, John falls down to worship the angel who is showing him this vision. The angel tells him that no, worship only God, so stand up, do not kneel to me, worship belongs to God alone. This is repeated almost verbatim later on in the book of Revelation, but is consistent with the Jewish belief and the Jewish tradition of angels manifesting God's glory as they served as intermediaries. We see that a few times in the Old Testament, where an angel came down in the form of a burning bush and God spoke from the burning bush. But here we now see a distinction. John kneels to the angel, but the angel says, no, stand up, worship God alone. And as we see in apocalyptic literature, one of the features of that style is that the vision is interpreted by an intermediary or a heavenly being. In the Old Testament, we saw angelic beings as intermediaries. But with the coming of Jesus, angelic intermediaries are no longer necessary, because Jesus has come. He's brought his salvation that is described as a great wedding feast in which the bridegroom takes his bride. And we declare Alleluia, celebrating the triumph and the judgment of God.